Hi, this is Speak Out Speech and Debate. With NSDA Nationals fast approaching, we'll be doing a topic analysis over what common arguments will be and what to expect in rounds. We'll go through definitions, framework, 3 affirmative arguments, then 3 negative arguments. All the cards that we provide will be cited at the top of the slide. So let's get started. The resolution is resolved. Government employees have a moral obligation to leak classified information to address injustice. So starting out with the affirmative framework, the first one you could use is structural violence. This ties in really well with justice as a value and the structural violence as the criterion. With this, you're saying that a lot of times leaks have been used to go against social structures that have been harmful towards people, whether they're oppressing them or discriminating against them. Then you could use consequentialism, which is really the idea that the ends justify the means. You can say that, yes, leaks have historically been seen as something with negative connotation, but in this case, we really need to look at the end results and how those have been helpful and have justified any small mistakes along the way. Then for roles, this is saying that justice is fairness. And this would work pretty well for affirmatives that want to really hone in on corruption, because corruption itself would violate roles, because that really only benefits people at the top of society since they can abuse the system to their own benefit. And so that's why leaks would be justified in that case. Then for the negative framework, you can use Hobbes, which is prioritizing social order over individual liberty. You can say that when we're thinking of this resolution, it's really asking us if this action would be moral. And with Hobbes, you would say that this is a morally wrong action because leaking classified information leads to chaos, and that would reduce the government's ability to keep the social order, and its citizens would then be harmed. So because of the social contract, we have to maintain it and keep classified information classified. Then for determinism, a good analogy for this, if you don't understand determinism, is that when you're hitting a ball in a game of pool, once you hit the ball, it's really just up to physics to determine where that goes. You and the balls have no say in where that's going to end up. So relating this back to leaks, you can say that once someone leaks classified information, they have no control over who uses that and how it is used. So then anyone out in the public could abuse that and instead harm the people that it was meant to help. Therefore, it's not justified. Then you could go on to talk about objectivism as another criterion. You would just have to show that leaks are actually for personal benefit and therefore not moral. Then, of course, you could use democratic norms or preserving governmental legitimacy as kind of a catch-all criterion. This could fit well in most cases if you're struggling to find one that really encompasses all your different points if they're kind of all over the place. So here are some generic definitions. You can pause to read them. The only real difference here, I'd say, is just on the leak and to-leak definitions. The leak one would probably be best for the affirmative, just because for the negative, you might want to use the to-leak one, which kind of has a more negative connotation of what leaking is, by saying that it's really meant to be classified. So then it kind of prefaces your case and shows that it's immoral to leak that information. Now let's start on the affirmative arguments. For some background, as our first point, leaks have been seen in the past as a necessity to protect liberties. And I'm just going to summarize this card. So it's basically talking about how unauthorized disclosures of classified information have become increasingly important and dangerous in recent years. Since 9/11, it's made whistleblowing more necessary due to factors like military and intelligence agencies significantly expanding in terms of funding, staff, status, and impact, and that these organizations heavily rely on advanced technology whose effects on personal freedom and human rights aren't fully grasped, even by those who create them. Also, the military's increased use of, for example, remotely piloted aircraft and covert operations has also made the realities of war and their consequences simply less apparent to the general public. So, therefore, it's seen as necessary to basically educate the public and let them know whenever all of these things are going on, since in the past we've seen the nefarious effects of when information is hidden from the public. And this also can be related to Edward Snowden, which is a different example, not stated here, but he was basically a former NSA contractor. He leaked classified documents to The Guardian, The Washington Post, which really revealed the NSA's mass surveillance activities. So before this, government officials had been giving misleading information about what exactly they were collecting, and the Supreme Court had dismissed a constitutional challenge because there was a lack of evidence. So through this, a lot of people were getting their information stolen against their will, and they had no idea what or how they were being violated. So by Snowden revealing what exactly was happening, he gave them the necessary evidence for them to take it to court and show that what the NSA was doing was unconstitutional. So that's a really good example of when leaking really benefited the public and was a necessary evil. So the second possible point on the affirmative that you could use is on the importance of free speech. Because historically, when there have been unjust orders from the state, they will warrant leaks from governmental employees in order to protect free speech. So for instance, this card is really talking about how U.S. courts haven't recognized a general right to access government information under the First Amendment. So even though the public has a lot of rights already, like accessing criminal proceedings, seeing certain related documents, and having this extended to civil proceedings, it still doesn't guarantee broad access to that information in the government. So because of this, a lot of courts have ruled that classification of information can override the constitutional right, even in limited cases where such a right is recognized. So what we're seeing here is that they're really arguing that the First Amendment should go farther and that there is a warrant for that, with these courts not recognizing that in those limited cases. So to continue on that, another instance where free speech is really important is when restrictions on leaks threaten free speech and the freedoms of the press. So in this card, we see that even politicians are urging the government to side with leakers. So the instance that this card is talking about is when 7 Democratic members of Congress sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland and urged him to drop the charges against the case that they were talking about, which is with the WikiLeaks publisher, Julian Assange. So they were just highlighting like the impact on press freedom if he were to be sent to the United States and imprisoned for a long time. So that letter that they made was really talking about the concerns raised by press freedom, civil liberty, human rights groups, and we're saying that if you press charges against that journalist, it would pose a significant threat to constitutionally protected journalistic activity. So then it goes on to talk about how lawmakers commended Garland for his revised news policy that prohibited the Department of Justice from using legal processes against journalists for obtaining information. And they were basically talking in that letter about the different support from different groups, how they had similar demands made by lawmakers in Australia, Brazil, Mexico, and the UK. So really the whole world was getting involved. And then the Democrats then talked about the negative consequences of continuing the prosecution, including undermining moral authority abroad and the restriction of press freedom under the First Amendment. So, of course, they called for an immediate drop of the charges against the journalists and an ending of the prosecution. So that's just an instance of where press freedom has been at risk. And of course, that is part of free speech and is extremely important because how else are people supposed to get information if the press is being limited? Then if you want some more international examples, you can look to Hungary and Turkey. In Hungary, under Viktor Orban's government, there was a capture of the State Media Council, which had major powers to impose fines and review media content. So then a lot of these independent media organizations had to face legal and extra-legal harassment. And so basically they had a lot of academic freedom that was being infringed on. They had bans on gender studies and talking about different genders to children. Then they were talking about how the government targeted the Central European University. So basically a lot of academic institutions were being targeted and they weren't allowed to talk about certain topics. Then in Turkey, under Recep Erdogan's leadership, the opposition's access to media platforms was restricted, and a lot of independent journalists were either fired or imprisoned. So, of course, if you have journalists that aren't even able to work, you're not going to have accurate information or even information at all. So that government even blocked YouTube and Twitter, dismissed judges, university faculty, cracked down on protests, and also criminalized personal criticism of the president. A lot of restrictions on free speech. And in 2022, they had a new law in Turkey that authorized imprisonment for spreading false information that could create fear and disturb public order. So then basically you can see that they were just trying to justify what they did and say that, hey, if anyone criticizes us, then they were just going to stop them and say that that would disturb public order. So therefore, leaks in that case would be justified, as you would be able to stop that and give the information to the public when all of these things like journalists have been imprisoned and university faculty aren't able to teach. The third point that you could talk about on the F is on legitimizing democracy, and the big impact here is on having a better quality of life and long-term benefits. So this card right here is talking about how leaks will keep politicians honest, because all of these people who are leaking the information are essential to a functioning democracy. And it goes on to explain that by saying that leaking is a common practice among politicians. Either they do it anonymously or through authorized channels, and there's a lot of honestly incentives for them to do it. They could be doing it to advance their own interests, to damage opponents, or to shape public perception through putting information through their own spin. Yet, these politicians will often display hypocrisy by condemning unauthorized leaks that embarrass them, despite leaking information themselves. So one notable example is when Melbourne's Herald Sun newspaper exposed the Australian government's plan to neglect war veterans and their widows. And this was based on leaked confidential documents. The government faced a lot of embarrassment and launched an investigation to identify who was the whistleblower and who the journalists were responsible for that. The journalists were saying that they were acting in accordance with professional ethics, and they refused to reveal their source in court and were facing potential jail time. So this situation really highlights the importance of protecting sources for journalists to ensure the disclosure of information that the government itself really wants to keep hidden to protect their own reputation. So without the ability to guarantee that source protection, then we wouldn't have been able to understand that that was what the government was doing and that they were not following through with what they promised to those war veterans and their widows. So through this, leaks is really about who it benefits, and it's important because it plays a vital role in holding those politicians accountable, and that it makes sure that information is getting out there even when the leak doesn't benefit that specific politician. So that really just maintains transparency in a democratic system and keeps things running smoothly and fair. So to follow up on this point on legitimizing democracy, another example can be when we're talking about the history of this. Well, whistleblowing became a lot more prevalent in the 60s and 70s because of advancements in knowledge, technology, and different organizations. So today, the widespread use of technology is really the major contributor to leaking. Digitization makes these really big challenges related to wrongdoing in ambiguous areas. So with this, digitization really involves collecting and using people's digital information without their knowledge or agreement for commercial and political purposes. It also makes it difficult to monitor and regulate intangible things such as money and assets. Again, examples like Edward Snowden, which we talked about earlier, Cambridge Analytica, and the Panama or Paradise Papers show how digitization creates these hidden activities that really escape legal control and democratic oversight. Because when you're talking about cyberspace, a lot of that is invisible. You can't touch it, you can't see it unless you're really on there and you know what you're doing. So through this, we see that leaking information or whistleblowing has become a lot more common as our world is becoming increasingly digital and reliant on technology. So therefore, we need to rely on leaks more to keep whoever's running these things honest and keep everything transparent for the people who aren't versed in these technologies. So then this card goes on to talk about the complexity of digitization, how being driven by technology really makes it harder, again, for people outside these areas to fully understand and keep track of what's happening, specifically journalists, activists, and lawmakers. So not everyone can be a computer scientist or a programmer, and they're not going to understand everything that goes on in the digital realm. So these whistleblowers who are in the digital realm and understand this, have insider knowledge, they really have a moral role, an important role, to share this information, raise awareness, and start these discussions to really help the future of our societies. So in all, digitization has really just made whistleblowing even more necessary. So this is talking about the immediacy. The impact here is on how we need this now. For instance, you can look to ChatGPT, OpenAI, all the stuff they're doing, and how in the future, of course, it's just becoming a bigger reality, and we need to expose hidden practices and stimulate conversations about important issues that a lot of people who aren't technically versed, they're not going to understand that. So leaking is going to become even more necessary in the future. Now let's move on to the negative side. So the first possible argument you could use on the negative is on unintentional leaks. How leaking is never really just one piece of information, especially today. This point really ties in well with the determinism framework that we talked about for the negative, because this is hammering in on the idea that once you put information out there, you don't know who's going to use it or how they're going to use it or how many people that they're going to spread it to, and so that could be used for nefarious reasons, and that information could actually have an immoral outcome. So the example we cite here is on the Pentagon Papers. It was a classic whistleblower leak. An insider exposed specific records to reveal illegal or immoral government actions. In contrast, recent leaks a lot of times include major quantities of records that the leaker might not have read, and those leakers are really just protesting against a single government policy, but also may consider themselves advocates for transparency and just try to make everything transparent. So this article is talking about this type of leak as the deluge leak, and it's saying that, hey, once you spring one leak, then more are going to start to spring out more and more, and then it just turns into this big flood. So therefore, more and more leaks are going to happen in the future, and these people are just trying to make everything transparent, and we don't know all the consequences that are going to come from it, because a lot of people could use that instead to hurt people instead of help them. Also, you could directly go against that point we talked about with the affirmative, how digitization warrants a need for leaks and how people need to be made aware of more things. You could go back and say through this card that since government systems are becoming more digital, a lot of employees and contractors have access to a lot of this government information, including very sensitive records. So technology actually has an opposite effect of making it easier to leak that information. So in the past, people had to make copies secretly, but now digital files can literally be stored, copied, shared in a second with just a couple clicks. Platforms like WikiLeaks also make it safer for leakers to remain anonymous. So that's a new trend with the deluge leaks that's just starting to happen. So you can talk about, yes, along this topic of immediacy with that impact, we're seeing that with the rise of technology, we actually need to stop these leaks because they're immoral because of the unknown factors out there. With all of these platforms and things coming up, springing up, you have no idea what that information is going to be used for and how much more information people can get to eventually hurt the people that were in the beginning supposed to be helped. So the second idea on the negative is talking about how whistleblowing may be morally praiseworthy, but it should not be morally obligatory for a government employee to put themselves through serious consequences just to leak classified information. So that's what we're getting into with this risks and consequences card. And this is going on to say with the George, which talks about the risks and challenges of reporting wrongdoing. So they say that it's best to report misconduct internally before going to external sources. So if you can't meet your supervisor higher-ups, well, you can still meet the internal reporting requirement by using designated channels, and reporting anonymously also counts. So basically, their idea for how reporting wrongdoing should go is internally first, because their idea is that a lot of times, particularly in private companies, it's not going to be morally praiseworthy or even morally beneficial if that person ends up getting harmed because, for example, being in a private company, you don't have all of those legal safeguards. So they shouldn't be morally obliged to prioritize others' interests over their own and their families. So therefore, we shouldn't criticize employees who choose not to report externally when legal protections are not sufficient. Along that note, whistleblowing is a morally tragic decision, according to this card, that really ends up harming the employer's interests. So this card goes on to say that the definition helps us understand why whistleblowers often face problems after speaking out. Whistleblowing is a tough choice, and that means failing to meet at least one obligation. And those whistleblowers themselves have to decide whether to prioritize their duty to the public or their duty to the employer. And in this case with leaks, they usually choose the public. Some people might argue that there's no real conflict because justified whistleblowing doesn't harm the employer's valid interests, but whistleblowing always goes against a moral duty that we should follow in normal situations, even if it can be outweighed in some cases. So that's why whistleblowers often face difficulties. They have harmed their employer's interests while breaking a moral obligation, which also raises questions about their actions, morality. And so you can compound upon that and then go on to say that leaking is immoral in that sense. Finally, on the negative, we have undermining international consequences. So this takes into account how classified document leaks undermine the confidence of allies and directly threaten lives. So this is taking a more international stance on the issue of leaks. So the release of secret U.S. documents, as this card says, about the Ukraine war is causing serious problems. It's hurting the trust of U.S. allies. It reveals sensitive information about Russia's military plans, and it shows weaknesses in Ukraine's air defenses. So we didn't know who leaked the documents, which of course is worrisome. And although the media didn't confirm if the documents were real, the U.S. officials were of course very concerned and suggested that they might actually be accurate. The Justice Department and Pentagon started investigating, but of course the damage was already done because that's what happens with leaks. Once the information is out there, it's really hard to control it. So this goes on to say that leaks are harmful because they share U.S. assessments of the war's progress, and while it doesn't reveal specific movements, it still provides a lot of valuable information that could put its sources in Russia at risk. So this is putting these people who are stationed, like U.S. people who are stationed in Russia, at very high risk. So through that, of course, you can argue that it's immoral, it's putting people in danger, and it was completely unnecessary. We could have protected those people's lives. And just to go on this vein of other recent leaks that you can include in your case, they're not included in this card here, but I'll go ahead and mention them anyways. CNN reviewed 53 leaked documents from mid-February to early March, right now in 2023. One document showed that the U.S. was spying on Ukraine's president, which wasn't surprising, but still upset Ukrainian officials. Another one revealed Ukraine's suggestion to strike Russian locations using drones. The leaks also mentioned China using Ukrainian strikes as an opportunity to paint NATO as the aggressor. A different document describes South Korean officials discussing the U.S. request for ammunition to send to Ukraine. And then another document discussed how the U.S. assesses allies' policies and influence them, including Israel's potential aid to Ukraine. And lastly, the leaks touch on European countries' intentions to donate fighter jets to Ukraine, like Bulgaria's offer, which poses a challenge as it would leave them without fighter aircraft until U.S.-made F-16s are delivered. So through this, we can see that, especially with the Ukrainian war, that's definitely going to be a hot topic, and you should expect that to be mentioned in rounds, definitely, if you don't already mention it yourself. So clearly, that's a great way to tie in other countries, give an international stance, and really magnify that impact on how it's affecting us globally. And that wraps all of it up. Leave any questions in the comments and we'll go ahead and get back to you. Good luck to everyone competing at nationals, and don't forget to follow us at speakout_speech on Instagram. Happy debating!